ultimately loses the fight and is in a state of breaking down. And Gamma goes over to him. He still thinks of them as friends, as brothers. So he goes over to Beta, and Beta just gets in one last cheap shot just to finish off Gamma, because fuck that robot. And so a damaged Gamma slowly limps out of the radius of Beta's explosion, and we learn that Beta actually had inside of it one of Birdie's little siblings, and then Gamma, on his last legs, gets a flash of that same picture that Birdie had in his pendant. Gamma falls over and explodes himself, and as you can predict at this point, inside is the other sibling of Birdie. This is why Gamma reacted so strangely to Birdie flying in front of his face before, because that moment kind of like awoken something inside of Gamma's AI of the bird that's inside of him. What's interesting about Gamma's story here is that it actually can genuinely be interpreted in multiple different ways, depending on how you see Gamma's behavior. You could easily interpret it simply as Gamma becoming self-aware thanks to Amy, reaching out to him, and him realizing, the good of helping others. After Amy reaches out to help Birdie and then reaches out to help him, he decides that he wants to help the birds trapped inside all the E-100 robots. But you could also kind of interpret it as, like, the bird inside of Gamma, its consciousness starting to, come through in Gamma's AI, and it's kind of like two beings inside of this robot. Gamma, the AI that has started to kind of become self-aware, and then the bird that's slowly influencing Gamma to do these things, to free all the animals. That last moment where Gamma gets that flash of the memory from the bird and he looks back at the other bird and falls over. Was that Gamma, or was that the bird inside of him? That's actually up to interpretation. There's some real stuff there. And of course, people get really into, the tragedy of how Gamma, in order to save all the birds and the bird trapped inside himself, he had to destroy and kill his friends and his family, and ultimately become destroyed himself. And, Gamma, this robot that became self-aware and decided to do good and free all these animals, he tragically had to end up dying himself. And at the hands of his own brother that vehemently hated him at that point, simply for him being better than Beta. There is genuinely, a fair number of layers going on here. This is really weird that a story of this much depth is in a fucking Sonic the Hedgehog video game, and it has, nothing to do with anything else in the main story. But it's pretty cool, and I really like it. And personally, I'm a big fan of, robot AI stories, so I really do appreciate this thing, and it's just an interesting idea, isn't it, to get to tell a story from the perspective of an Eggman robot and or one of the animals trapped inside of an Eggman robot, and kind of tell a story about, those creatures that always are just kind of background elements in the Sonic games. It's really cool. So those are the stories of Sonic Adventure. A mixed bag, very literally, because it's all just a bunch of singular stories that basically have very little to do with each other, for the most part. There are some connected stories, Sonic and Tails are connected in a way, Sonic and Knuckles are connected to the main story with Chaos, Amy and Gamma are connected. There are things here that are pretty good, but I feel like trying to connect all of these stories together was maybe a bit overly ambitious, because it ends up bringing a lot of negatives into the story that draw these things down. On top of that, the way that these cutscenes are conveyed, to me, it really does hurt the vast majority of the storytelling, because while I can tell you these stories and make them sound interesting and engaging, when you actually play through the game and you watch all these cutscenes, it is fucking boring because of how slow-paced these cutscenes are and how just uninteresting they are to watch with these same stock animations getting reused over and over and over again. Unfortunately, the main story I find to be kind of on the weaker side, and Sonic and Knuckles, everyone's two favorite Sonic characters, have the worst stories out of any of them. Amazingly, the side characters and the characters no one cares about, like Big, are the ones that have the really good stories with really nice themes in this game. However, at the end of the day, I really struggle to say that Sonic Adventure has a great story because of how poorly it is told. But there's definitely potential here. This was really written with heart. They were really trying to tell a great bunch of little stories here. And I really appreciate that, and I can see what they were going for, and I think there's a lot of potential in it to be something really good. So at the end of it all, if you were to ask me if I thought the story of Sonic Adventure was good, I would say that the story in the game, a little bit, kind of. The story of Sonic Adventure that exists in my head, where the story is told properly, that's great. And, every other medium that you can know. We open on a shot of a military helicopter flying in the sky. There's radio chatter of soldiers talking about a captured hedgehog, and after a bit of a tussle, Sonic the Hedgehog emerges from the helicopter. He makes a quippy one-liner about there being no food or movies on this flight, rips a piece of the plane wing off, and then uses that as a snowboard as he jumps off the helicopter and plummets down to the city below. A lot of people will tell you that the opening to Sonic Adventure 2 is pretty great, and for good reason, because this opening is very effective in doing all of the things that it needs to do. Primarily, to me, the thing that this opening conveys is that this is going to be a very different Sonic story than anything we've seen up to this point. But before we start talking about the actual story of Sonic Adventure 2, I want to quickly touch on the storytelling of the game, because that has improved substantially over Sonic Adventure 1. Now we have proper, unique animations for all of the cutscenes with actual pacing and directing. There's less cutscenes, but they're not as long, while at the same time having more things happen in the cutscenes, vastly improving the pacing of the game and the story thanks to that. I don't have an issue with the way that the story is told. Like, the cutscenes still have their problems. They're still pretty primitive, the animation is still not great, and there's a lot of issues here and there. But I can actually pay attention to the story and be engaged in what's happening this time around. However, there are still some pretty significant issues with the storytelling as well. The biggest one, I would say, is the pacing. While I said it's a good thing that the pacing has been increased now, it's actually kind of been increased a bit too much. The story of this game is way too fast-paced. Take this scene here, for example, where Rouge is on the Space Colony Ark, hacking into the computer to figure out some stuff about Project Shadow, until the sensors detect the heroes show up, and so Rouge decides to take advantage of that situation. But look at how quickly we go from that first plot point to the second one, Rouge on her computer getting data, and then her reacting to the heroes showing up. In the actual cutscene, look at how quickly that change happens. It's basically instantaneous. We go right from one story beat immediately to the next, and this is a constant problem that happens throughout all of Sonic Adventure 2, of just going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, immediately without giving anything time to breathe. This results in the story coming at the audience way too quickly, and I think it's one of the main reasons that people call the story of Sonic Adventure 2 confusing and convoluted, because they're constantly throwing so much information at you. It's very easy to miss story details and not know exactly what's going on. But that's not the only issue that the storytelling of Sonic Adventure 2 has. There is a much bigger one, probably the biggest issue that the entire game's story has overall, which is the split story of the hero side and the dark side. In Sonic Adventure 1, it was 7 separate stories that were tied together, and so it made sense to see it from all those different perspectives, because they were each telling their own different unique stories with their own beginning, middle, and end. That is not how Sonic Adventure 2's story works. When you really look at it and you examine the scenes and how they're constructed, how they're directed, how cutscenes pace into each other, and when you lay out the story, it actually becomes very apparent to me that this game's story was not written with the intention of being broken up into 2 halves. It is very clear that this was one story written from the beginning to the end linearly, and then it was split into 2 pieces, basically divvied up amongst the good guys and bad guys, and this results in many, many issues when you actually play through Sonic Adventure 2 doing one of the 2 sides of the story. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's actually a mod that someone created for Sonic Adventure 2 on PC where it gets rid of these two stories, the hero story and the dark story, and instead combines the two campaigns into a singular story played in a linear fashion where you jump back and forth across all 6 characters. And I gotta say, playing through the game with this mod, holy shit, the story is so vastly superior when you just go through it the way it was actually intended to be gone through. Everything makes so much more sense, everything works better, it's so much easier to understand what's happening, and there is such better use of things like setups and payoffs that make the story feel way more satisfying. So actually, for this video, I'm not going to be talking about the story of Sonic Adventure 2 as it exists by default in the game. I'm going to be talking about the story of Sonic Adventure 2 from the perspective of using this mod, using the version of the story as it was written, as it was intended. Rather than having this single story broken in 2 pieces, let's look at the story when it is whole and when it is working the way it is supposed to. So, starting from the actual beginning of the story, we actually begin on Dr. Eggman. He is raiding a top-secret military base in search of some sort of top-secret government research project that he plans to take for himself. And not only is this just some government research project, it was created by Eggman's grandfather. And right off the bat, we already have something that feels a little odd for Sonic stories in comparison to the previous games, which is where we need to talk about the writer of Sonic Adventure 2, because this was the first Sonic game written by Shiro Maekawa, and he admittedly has said that he did not like the Sonic series the way it was before, and he deliberately made an attempt to change the way that Sonic is done for his stories and in Sonic Adventure 2, and you can see that right off the bat with how this story begins. I mean, the government, the military, that has never been a thing in the Sonic universe before, but suddenly we have secret government facilities and projects and weapons and stuff. I mean, having a military itself just feels kind of odd in comparison to all the previous games, doesn't it? Whatever happened to, Eggman and his army of cartoony, animal-looking robots and, going to mystical islands to hunt for the Chaos Emeralds? Like, no. This is not that kind of story. We're doing something very different here. And it's not just the tone that's been changed, but even the characters have been slightly rewritten. I mean, not too different, they're still mostly the same, but, Sonic definitely has a couple more extra traits from, the American version of Sonic, actually. He's got a couple of extra quippy one-liners, and he's a bit more sarcastic in this game than he's ever been before. And this is also where we introduce the whole thing of Knuckles being a treasure hunter, which just comes completely out of nowhere. That's never been established in any of the previous games. He's just suddenly, out of nowhere, for no reason, a world-renowned treasure hunter, which doesn't even make sense for his character because he never leaves Angel Island. So I think stuff like that is a product of Maekawa wanting to change up the series a little bit. And I actually want to touch on the military and why they exist in this story, because if you think about it from a writing perspective, it's pretty easy to see how things ended up the way that they did. Because for this game, they wanted to have Eggman as a playable character, right? So what's Eggman's enemy faction going to be? It's obviously not going to be Eggman robots. You gotta have him fight something else. But what's he gonna do? Fucking kill people or kill animal characters? Obviously not. So he's gotta fight another robot faction of some kind. And so we introduce the human military as a faction for Eggman to fight. And I actually don't hate the inclusion of this kind of thing, because one of the criticisms I had for Sonic Adventure 1's story is that the humans basically were like background elements. They weren't even characters, they were nothing. However, here, this time around, we actually do have the humans and the military involved in a good chunk of the story, which actually makes it feel like this is a world populated by people. I also really like how the opening cutscene does a really good job of establishing that even though this is the human military, the government, they're no match for Eggman. He's a genius. He's able to create machines that will outclass anything they could make. And he's just plowing through this military base, and there's nothing they can do to stop him. He basically sees them as a joke. And that does a really good job of establishing that Eggman is a serious threat. In all the previous games, he's been a little silly, a little cartoony. We've never had anything to compare him against other than Sonic, who's always been defeating him. But this shows that for the regular world, Eggman, he can basically do whatever he wants, and no one can get in his way. This is the kind of thing I was talking about when I said Sonic Adventure 2 does a much better job with telling its story, because you just get this feeling with the way that the cutscene is directed and done. Although one thing that's really stupid, I have to say, is the name of the military, because the military in this game is called GUN, or the Guardian Units of Nations, aka GUN. Like, that's such a fucking ridiculous, stupid acronym for a military. I fucking love it. One detail I like about Gun's robots is that, you know how Eggman's robots are powered by animals that he captures and shoves inside them? Well, Gun, obviously being the government, isn't going to do something that evil, and their robots are actually powered by, like, these artificial chaos drives that, are manifestations of chaos energy. So that's just a nice little thing, that Eggman's robots are powered by animals, and Gun's robots are powered more humanely. Anyway, after Eggman has blasted his way through the military base, he gets to the top-secret research project that he was looking for. And by entering the password Maria into the console, he's able to get access and release the project. And after unlocking it, he finds a hedgehog, one that apparently resembles Sonic quite a bit. And this mysterious hedgehog introduces himself as Shadow, and he pledges allegiance to Eggman as thanks for releasing him from his cryostasis right when a Gun robot shows up to apprehend them. And Shadow, wanting to show off his power to his new master, disposes of the Gun robot like it's nothing. After that, Shadow tells Eggman to bring Chaos Emeralds to the Space Colony Ark, whatever that is. Ooh, mysterious. And then he wanders off on his own. Ooh, what's going on? See, to me, this works very well as a prologue to the story. It's very common in stories like this that you start the prologue foreshadowing some mysterious new threat. And so having Eggman raid the military base and awaken Shadow, and now it's like, ooh, who's this character? It really feels like the way this story was supposed to begin. Now we have a little bit more context for what's going on here. Sonic is being pursued by the military because they think that he's Shadow, who has escaped from their research facility, and they're trying to get him back. Makes perfect sense now, but Sonic has no idea what's going on in this instance. Meanwhile, Eggman returns to his base in a pyramid, and he checks the news to find that, what? Shadow has apparently stolen a Chaos Emerald and is running around on the loose in the same city that Sonic is in. And the news has mistakenly labeled Shadow as Sonic. And this is where I want to talk about that story element, because this is something that a lot of people have a lot of issues with, and a lot of people misunderstand what's going on here. Because you always hear people saying, how could anyone possibly mistake Shadow for Sonic? Like, these two look nothing alike. Come on now, this is ridiculous. How am I supposed to buy into this? What the fuck is going on? This is stupid and doesn't make any sense. You see, because Shadow is a secret government research project, as well as some other story elements that we'll get to later, there's actually a good chance that Gun is trying to cover up the existence of Shadow, so they're pinning it on Sonic. They fed the news that false information, that Sonic is the one, that escaped from the research facility, and he's the one that stole the Chaos Emerald, and, they're just, following what they're told to by the military. Except no. That's not what's happening here. That's something that a lot of fans like to pretend is what's going on here. Like, that's purely a fan theory. There is absolutely nothing in the game to actually support that being the case in what's going on here. And looking at the story, I really don't think that's the case at all. I really do genuinely think that the story is simply just that people think Shadow and Sonic look the same, including themselves. There is multiple lines of dialogue, not just from Gun, but from many characters where they mistake Shadow for Sonic or compare the two as being very similar. Eggman himself, when he first sees Shadow, he thinks he's Sonic. Same thing with Amy when she runs into Shadow, she thinks it's Sonic. And even Sonic himself, when you look at some of his level recaps for the story, he says that Shadow looks exactly like him. And later on in the story, Shadow has a line where he says that there's more to Sonic than just looking like him. There's even cut lines of dialogue that was originally going to be in the game where Shadow says something along the lines of, "You really do look like me. It's like looking into a mirror. You're like my shadow." So it's very clear to me that the intention of the story is just that Sonic and Shadow look similar, and that makes a whole lot more sense when you consider the fact that most likely the story was written before Shadow's design was